Somdeep Sen, welcome to Troublemakers.
Thank you.
It's good to have you.
Thank you, man.
Today I'd like to talk about postcolonialism and especially your book, Decolonizing Palestine, Hamas Between the Anticolonial and the Postcolonial, where you explore some of this. Is postcoloniality, it's kind of liminal in nature, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So what is it? What is postcolonialism and why use Hamas to understand it?
Well, I understand post-colonialism. On the one hand, there is a temporal argument in terms of it talking about an era after the formal end of colonialism. But it's also about understanding or recognizing the long shadow of colonialism and how that shapes international relations and the way societies, states, communities interact with each other, how we imagine ourselves in the global order, often in a very hierarchical nature. But it's also about shapes the parameters of, how we understand the world, but also how we imagine and what kind of, how we imagine our future, what kind of priorities what kind of things we prioritize, what kind of goals, what do we want to look like, right? One example that, I like to give is, sort of talking about this long shadow of colonialism is, the chief minister of the state that I grew up in, West Bengal, in the eastern part of India. She once said that she wanted to make Calcutta like London. Now, anyone who's lived in London knows that it's a wildly unlivable city, right?
Right.
And why would you want to be like
These
London?
great aspirations.
Right. But it's because, that's what we understand development. That's what we understand growth. That's what we understand progress as, right? So it's to understand, it's to recognize those long shadows. Bringing that back to to a conversation on Palestine, I often felt that when we talked about an organization like Hamas, we were not recognizing how Hamas, but also Gaza and Palestine is embedded in this hierarchical global order that continues to be shaped by these long legacies of colonialism and imperialism. That shapes, if we recognize that, we can place Palestine not as this one-off conflict that is the break from the norm, but then we can understand, place Palestine, also Hamas, on this sort of long trajectory of liberation, right? I mean, Fanon talks about this a lot, where, colonialism doesn't end with the flight of the colonizer, right? The way colonial endeavors are kept up is it breaks down and remakes the colonized societies, native communities, in a way that helps the upkeep of the colonial endeavor, right? That means material reorganizations, but also reorganization of the mind, right? So then it becomes interesting to place Hamas and Gaza within that sort of project, which Israel is very much, it's very, very much a settler colonial state, which I argue in that book. But then it's also about, looking at, so I was very much, as I was mentioning earlier, I did my PhD in a very white academic environment. I was the first foreign PhD to be hired ever. One of the first things that I was asked the first day by another PhD was like, what theory are you using? Which was a wild question for me because I hadn't done any data collection, and why would I choose a theory beforehand? But it also tells you of the long shadow of colonialism and imperial thinking that shapes many of these disciplines, and the tools that are supposedly available to us for studying a place like Palestine. And they're very limited, right? When you look at sort of the genealogy of studies of Palestine, especially in the West, traditionally, it's about terrorism, it's about fundamentalism, Islam.
There are certain topics that must be
exactly
kind of explored, and if you're doing anything else, you're kind of wrong.
Exactly. And that's something I wanted to break away from, where I thought, okay, why don't I look at first of all, place Palestine, Gaza, Hamas alongside the pantheon of anti-colonial movements around the world. Use theoretical insights, empirical insights from them. Compare them, contrast them. Then what does that do to our understanding of Hamas? What does that do for our understanding of Palestinian liberation? But more generally, what does that do to our understanding of how and when liberation happens, right? And that's, again, like a key purpose of the book, is to break away from this very, I don't know if this is the right terminology, but like an economic framework for understanding liberation, right? Did this cause independence? No, then it was worthless. But if we look at the long history of liberation movement, they often take, winding, circuitous paths. A lot of times it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
We go back and forth. That is not the fault of the liberation struggle, but that's only a reflection of how brutal and treacherous colonial endeavors can be, which often means that you end up taking these long roundabout circuitous paths, and not everything leads to liberation right away.
I think that's one of the big strengths of your book, is that, even in these moments of victory, movements may be struggling for independence or self-determination of some kind. They're kind of like, wait, we won, but we thought we weren't close to winning yet. And then tomorrow they're like, oh crap, actually we haven't won. This is a long process of liberation on many fronts, and I think your book kind of like explores this with a kind of complexity that especially on the left, our kind of political framings and discourse are ironically steeped in these very kind of like black and white binary kind of like understandings of things. But you also alluded to, you mentioned during your PhD, somebody asked you what theory are you using to explore this topic, and you described, pulling these different, Fanon and different influences into your lens to understand Hamas and to understand decolonization. I feel like another strength of your kind of writing is this kind of epistemological freedom that you have. You start the book by writing just a first person narrative, personal story about a place you're visiting. These things come up throughout all the chapters. I met this friend for dinner, and then this happened. How do we understand what happened in the neighborhood that night in light of this, broader theory from Gramsci or something? You look into political history. There's a little bit of anthropology. Is it very deliberate that you do this, or is it just kind of naturally your pace, your flow in making sense of things?
Well, I guess it is in a way deliberate, because the other way of the traditional academic way of writing didn't make sense to me, right? Because oftentimes the real world, especially in a discipline like political science, anthropology is different, and you have a bottom-up approach, and you forefront these stories and so on and so forth. But then in political science, you have these grand theories, and then reality has to fit into it, right? So, and I tried doing that, right? And I cringe at some of the titles of the early draft papers that I wrote, because I was constantly trying to fit into this framework. And what happened was that, even like trying to do field work was frowned upon at the political science department that I was at. In fact, they told me that, political scientists don't do field work, so don't actually talk to people. They just keep the theories and apply things and test theories. Then the second sort of barrier was, they told me that, well, insurance wouldn't cover you if you go to Gaza, which wasn't true, but, they said that. But it was also this idea that if I use theories, theoretical voices like Fanon, that would immediately put me on the sidelines of the discipline.
Yeah, it sort of discredits you in a way. Because
exactly.
Yeah.
So there are certain main white European scholars who you're supposed to be inspired by. If you're a political scientist, you stay within that, and that makes sense. But then I think what happened was, once I went to Gaza, just sort of the opening story where I talk about traveling from Egypt through the Rafah border into Gaza. I think that whole experience to me sort of clicked something in my head, where I was like, well, none of these theories make sense. And why are we constructing these theories, in Copenhagen, and then sort of, shoving it down the throats of the people here, rather than, navigate this place with a certain openness and see what kind of images that brings back. Images about my life, my background, my assumptions about what a liberation movement is meant to look like. At some point, I've talked about this publicly, about, having to meet a Hamas official for the first time. And, I was dressed sort of like this. And then the person who was introducing me, he said, well, you can't go like that. You got to wear a suit. And I was like, well, these are fighters, it's a revolution. Who wears a suit? Yeah. But then I had to literally wear a suit, and go suit shopping in Gaza, which is a surreal experience. But then to sit with the Hamas official, who then talks in a very bureaucratic way about state building, but also liberation. And that sort of nuances your understanding. And if we don't forefront those stories, then what is the point of all of this, right? So it became... So, at some point I lost all sense of, the...
Having to adhere to the rigid...
Exactly. I was out in Gaza, no one back in Copenhagen really knows what I'm encountering here, and have no life experience to really understand. Mm-hmm. And then when I got back from Gaza, that's when I started picking up, books from all over the world, stories from all over the world, which then really helped me understand Palestine and Gaza specifically, in a very different way. And that I found it so fruitful, but also like, enlightening, right? I would like to write books or, pieces that, that I write, in Copenhagen, but someone in Dar or Songea or Nairobi can read, be like, you know what, this happens here too.
This makes sense.
This makes sense too. And I find that I understand Palestine more when I look at these global forces that are circulating everywhere, right? Even now I'm working on a book on land and colonialism, and just reading about the Maji Maji here in Tanzania, or just navigating the Usa River here, right? Yeah. Look at long colonial histories of land ownership, of the settler ownership of land, of why is it that a Dutch third generation Tanzanian has these huge swaths of land, while local Black Tanzanians only have the strip of land on the side of the highway to grow their crops. Mm-hmm. There is something wildly problematic with that. But then that also reminds me of Palestine, of settler land ownership, and how, the kind of, how they settled the land, how they civilized the land, and what happened to natives, and so on and so forth. So to me, that's the only way to do it, because, it's part of a global struggle. Obviously, you don't want to minimize the struggles of the people, in Palestine by comparing it with other places. But nonetheless, it's important to take this global perspective, I think.
Somdeep, it sounds like you are really trying to dwell within the complexities of reality, because reality is complex, and it's, would you say that it's inherently problematic to reduce that complexity?
Absolutely.
And one of the things that you explore in your book, that in our movements we often talk about without complexity, is violence. You cover anti-colonial violence in particular. And I wonder if your research on Hamas or any other research has broadened your understanding of violence and of resistance?
Yeah, I mean, to answer your first question, yeah, I mean, it is, immensely problematic to simplify very complex realities. But again, we have to contextualize this in the sense that disciplinarily, but also if you look at the politics of higher education, you're being forced to simplify. This leads to this, right? We're trying to mimic sort of natural science ways of understanding the world, which then in immensely complex things like race, racism, gender, sexuality don't have a place in the scientific world because they're too sort of, it's neither this or that. So I think that with resistance, yes, I came in with a certain very clear-cut understanding of how armed resistance happens, right? And, I looked at, armed resistance movements around the world, in South Asia, Southern Africa, and sort of had this sort of very, clear understanding of why the sort of the therapeutic act of resistance, which is there in, say, Fanon's writing or whatever, right? But the complexity of it came to light when I started talking to Palestinians in Gaza, where, on the one hand, yes, we must fight, but what is the cost of it, right? And oftentimes we're the ones left behind, dealing with a huge level of human and material costs for it. And that doesn't necessarily, that feeling often lives alongside the urge to say, we need to fight, right? And that's a very uncomfortable thing to sit with. That
people aren't sweeping under the rug the fact that this might get a little messy.
No, they're not. And they mourn it. They talk about it afterwards, So you have to have the ability to sit down and listen to those stories, right? I mean, one of the really sort of memorable experiences. I mean, of course, you had these interviews with young Palestinians in Gaza who would sort of have a critical take on Hamas's resistance, because that again became sort of a branding issue for the organization to establish its leadership, where everything was resistance, as they would joke, right? While which of course they were weaponizing that often to have a very brutal control over Gaza and political dissidents and so on and so forth. But the complexity of resistance or the urge to fight sort of really was hammered home for me when I was actually in the West Bank. And I remember we were taking sort of a shared taxi from one place to another. And the shared taxi had to sort of slow down because young Palestinian kids from a refugee camp on the right side of the road were throwing rocks sort of over the road at Israeli soldiers on the other side. And then eventually we went through. And if you look at the faces of the other passengers, and who were all Palestinians, they weren't going, yay. They were going, and because they recognize that, yes, we have to fight, but these are young kids and, the soldiers don't care. They might shoot them, right? Yeah. So they understand the tragedies of those and and the downside, if you want to call it that, and the complexity of a liberation movement. And that was really important for me. I don't write about that every day, but it's anywhere, but it's something that really stuck with me to understand that sort of uncomfortable, tragically uncomfortable feeling that Palestinians under occupation, under siege, are compelled to sit with. Right?
Sure. You also say the boundary between the act of physical violence and the symbolizing, celebration, exhibition, and recounting of violence is often blurred. And in the next chapter, you go on to kind of describe like the ripple effects of this, the pervasive, social, economic, political, etc. situation that so many people live in. You use this phrase "losing it" when things just go haywire. The mental health, emotional health kind of atmosphere of families, neighbors, etc. You relate a story of an argument that escalates between two brothers as a way of kind of illustrating this mental environment that's created when Palestine is under siege, can you talk a bit about, the relationship between the situation in Palestine and this kind of this ripple effect that creates kind of like a new reality, the normalcy of losing it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very tragic environment because all of it becomes a performative act, right? Where losing it happens a lot there. I mean, I went to Shujaiya, which is a neighborhood that was completely pummeled, by Israel, during this assault, and it's a neighborhood known for having a concentration of Palestinian armed groups. And the neighbor of a friend of mine, her family had lost, or she had lost at least like 3 kids, in Israeli attacks, and he was part of an armed group. And he would tell me that, in front of the camera, she would say, "I'll give another son and I'll give another son for the liberation of Palestine." But when the cameras would turn off, she would be crying all day, right? And that's sort of the tragic reality of Palestine. That's why this Between the Anticolonial and Postcolonial sort of came in. At the beginning of this project, I kept talking about these incongruent realities, or things that don't make sense, right? And a professor of mine was like, "Well, the world is full of things that don't make sense, right?" And that sort of kind of shaped the way I navigated Gaza as well, and Palestine more generally, where you have this extreme level of downturn in terms of family relations, social relations, mental health, yet you are engaged in a liberation movement where you are compelled to talk about how you're willing to fight, yet you break character every now and again, and you criticize the liberation faction for only being being tied up in this jingoism of liberation, right? So this sort of, it's a very uncomfortable story to write about, because it's not a clean,
right,
good, bad, this is what's going to happen, right?
Easy to prove a point.
To prove a point. And I was very worried about writing this story because,
it's like not clear enough to seem authoritative, or
it's not clear enough. It is critical at different levels. It is showing that, I don't want to say like the fallacies of liberation, but also showing the idiosyncrasies of a liberation movement, of an independent struggle. And what happens is that, when we talk about independence on the other side, right? When the Union Jack, and if you watch any Bollywood movies about independence, they have the scene of the Union Jack coming down and the Indian flag coming up, right? It's very sort of linear sort of story,
one
right?
reality to another,
exactly,
in a matter of seconds.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
And so oftentimes when you're talking about independence and liberation on the other side, you have this very linear trajectory, right? And those sort of those idiosyncrasies, those complexities, those things that don't quite neatly fit in that narrative disappear, right? And I thought that, at least with this book, it was important to talk about those things, and not to in any way undermine the endeavor of a liberation struggle, but to again understand at the various levels at which colonial deformation can set in, right? Where it forces you to hate yourself. It forces you to hate anything that is associated with yourself, and then craving for the other, for recognition or whatever from the colonizer or the former colonizer. And that's what the book ends with as well, where we talk about how my grandfather, and we looked up to him because all his suits came from London, and he wrote books about India.
And he
but
had perfect English.
Perfect English, Chase perfect. I don't know if it was actually perfect, but I remember it being perfect, right? And that was very much.
Well, there's like a mysteria for you.
Yeah.
Like this was a almost larger than life person in your family.
Absolutely. But then he was so also tied to this, larger than life image of the world out there, the Western world, right? Even now I catch myself going to London, the metropole, and going, London. And then I'm like, then you see all
and then you round the corner and what do you see?
Yeah, then you're like, this is what you got.
Oh, this is London, actually.
Yeah. But but it's interesting that it how that things like that set in, right? So yeah, it's important to, I think, and recognize all of these things and not paper over them in this, in our storytelling of what's happening in the world. So yeah.
You talk about in Dar es Salaam this feeling that emerged where you noticed your deep desire to be and identify as subaltern.
Yeah.
So maybe tell us that story. First of all, tell us what is subaltern.
Yeah.
And then maybe you can share that story with us.
I mean, in my mind, subaltern is, an individual or a group of people that are, struggling to make a sense of who they are in a very hierarchical world, while also being entirely shaped in their identity and positionality by the, long legacies of colonialism and imperialism and white supremacy. So the story specifically that you're talking about, it was, 2018, I had the opportunity to stay in Dar es Salaam for a month. And, I actually went back to the same spot, this past week. And, where it was interesting to me because, I don't see myself as, my experience in the global north has been of a racial minority and the subject of, or the target of racism and Islamophobia and all of that, and xenophobia. So, when I come to a country in East Africa, I assume that there would be a common line of conversation or a common basis for me to interact with the people from that country. But then you realize how, colonialism set up hierarchies and, in different parts of the world in different ways. And, when you think about coloniality, it's not just about the actual colonial endeavor, but it also set up these roles and identities, right? That certain people feel like they can graduate to, and then use that and weaponize that to marginalize other groups of people. And, right now I'm working on a project on Hindu nationalism, and in many ways, Hindu Indians in the diaspora fit that category. They see themselves as having graduated to, the level of civilization, of white civilization, right? Which is why you will find, say, in North America, for instance, you'd have Hindus for Trump. Then Hindu nationalist American citizens have been rallying around the far right in the U.S. And, in many ways, they don't consider themselves to be, an immigrant community, right? And even if they are, they're the good immigrant. And,
Right.
So, that was my first-hand encounter with that, where suddenly I was not considered on equal terms by the Tanzanians that I encountered. Not everyone, but those that I encountered, a lot of the people that I encountered, and somehow was placed on the same table as the white South African development worker or the Brit or the American, right? Which again sort of triggered this feeling in me is like, okay, so where do I fit in this hierarchy, right? What does it mean to be? Am I liberated? On the one hand, I'm socialized in this place, India, where you looked up to the metropole and all of the things that they represent. Yet I'm here craving to find some level of equality with the local population, and in a very sort of arrogant way, not recognizing, my role, implicit, explicit role in other types of racial hierarchies that are there. So again, it makes the whole idea of liberation very complicated, right? And again, it is so deforming when it comes to how we think about the world and how we think about ourselves, that you can have a large, in a place like Tanzania, you can have a large South Asian community that has been here 3-4 generations, that can speak Swahili, yet see themselves at a different racially, higher category than the local Tanzanian population.
I mean, for me, one of the most fascinating places on earth to just watch people is sort of the edge of Stone Town in Zanzibar, because you have such a clash of identities and histories and social class. And I always found it kind of poetic and fascinating, because there are so few of these, like, can we say like third spaces, or like places where like, because a third space, I guess these days can also mean like the people in your neighborhood where they congregate to meet, who can maybe look like you and have lives that relatively resemble yours. But I feel like there are some of these liminal kind of like neighborhoods where, you can find people whose families generations back have had all kinds of like intertwined, bizarre circumstances that can't easily be explained by their nationality, language, class privilege. It seems like that kind of like mingling is kind of hard to come by these days.
It is, and mix sort of the racial dynamics with class, and it becomes even less. I mean, again, I've been working on Hindu nationalism in the last few years, and now we're looking at, Hindu nationalist communities, diaspora communities in Africa, and specifically Southern Africa. But being in East Africa is also quite revealing how there is no real interaction, right? You sort of, people are there's hierarchical, but then you sort of parallelly move around, but, people aren't really interacting in a real, in a real sense. A lot of the community, the South Asian community, the men will bring their wives from India, right? So there's not even that sort of intermarriage within, for most of them, right? Which creates these very odd, gated communities, and, real gated communities, but also in a metaphorical sense, where people are interacting, people are saying, Karibu, Asante, but they're not really interacting.
This is what's on the menu.
Exactly, right? It's not, and I see that with, the kind of schools, the international schools that are here around here, the kind of expat-oriented, resort sort of spaces as well.
Yeah.
It's people are there, they're next to each other, but they're not really interacting, right?
Yeah.
And
or they're interacting based on the protocols of capitalism and survival amidst it.
Exactly. I mean, I noticed this in South Africa. Of course, that has a specific history there.
Yeah.
But, one of the, I was visiting Johannesburg, and a friend of mine said that, if you look at the tables, and we went to this sort of fancy restaurant kind of lunch place. He said, if you look at the tables, all the tables are racially homogenous. And the only one that's mixed is a work lunch, right? Even when you go to shops and you see the white South African interacting with a black South African, they're talking to each other, but there's no real eye contact. So I remember one woman going, it's hard to reveal that in a podcast, but they would go, can I get a samosa, please? And she doesn't look all the way up into his eyes, right? She just sort of says it, looks a little bit up, but then looks away. And there's no, it's sort of like, you're not worth my time to really engage with you.
Acknowledge as a human.
Acknowledge as a human, exactly. And that's how I sort of feel here as well, you know? Again, everyone's very polite and they all sort of say hello and thank you, but, you know.
There's a part of me that feels a little bit happy to be treated rudely sometimes in Tanzania. Like, there's this whole kind of idea that Tanzania has a streak of xenophobia that maybe some of its neighbors don't have, including and possibly especially toward neighboring Africans. But I like it when it's a little bit directed toward me as a white person. Like, oh, you're not going to speak Swahili. Of course, there is a problematic, you know,
Yeah.
and I can maybe banter with them in my broken grammar Swahili enough. But sometimes that's what I need to do to be acknowledged. And, and it kind of makes me happy, you know, because I've been so accustomed to people just looking at my color and then pandering to me.
Right.
And that puts me in a position that makes me extremely uncomfortable. So it's nice, you know, as a white person sometimes to like have the opposite happen to you, where somebody is, especially if you sense that it comes from their sort of fatigue or, you know, their self-determination in some way.
Yeah.
So you're studying this kind of global growth of the far right, Hindu nationalism. We have a tendency to think that the right wing is like, I have this tendency, especially like to think that the right wing is inherently, you know, nationalistic, reactionary. It's kind of like based on the conservative traditions of maybe a particular country. But you've been looking at how this is an interconnected global movement, is it not? And maybe you can give us a quick overview of what's happening at kind of like the global level,
right,
with the momentum of this kind of interconnected right wing.
Right. I mean, it's been a very interesting development also with Trump coming to the fore, and because of America's positionality in the global order, what has meant that you've suddenly, what's come out of the woodworks and what many of us have been noticing is, you know, the proliferation of far-right groups around the world, but also how they're connected. So Trump has sort of brought all of that to light, even though the connections were already there. So what we're saying is that you have, you know, a very sort of, you have a far-right radical groups that are coming up that are rooted in, you know, concerns and, let's say, what they perceive as challenges in a very national context. But they also recognize that for them to be able to upend liberal institutions, democratic checks and balances, they need to create a more permissive global order. And what they see is that organizations like the UN and you know, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, there's this sort of liberal elite that, you know, rambles on about human rights and freedoms and all of that, but but you know, it's run by a very small global elite of you know, who you know, elite individuals who navigate in a certain strata of society and don't understand the real challenges of the people. So what's happened is that you have an almost cosmopolitan global right, which is very interesting because, you know, locally they are propagating xenophobic ideas and ideologies and policies. Yet on a global stage, they are, you know, truly global and have this global revolutionary impulse because all they understand that we need to upend the liberal global order. And what's become quite interesting is that these alliances are operating across the North-South divide. So you of course have, you know, interactions between Trump and Orban in Hungary and Meloni in Italy, right, in the global North, but global South countries are operating on equal terms. So you have Javier Milei in Argentina, who came to power, who became famous actually in 2023 when he did a a TikTok video of him ripping off names of various government institutions from a whiteboard, right? And I think he was saying afuera or something like that. He was just ripping it off. And his whole idea was that he would take the chainsaw to the to an overexpanded Argentinian government and bring the economy back to life, right? So he won. He would actually bring chainsaws to rallies, right? He won. And then over the last year, he shut down 200 government institutions, including, and specifically, any institution that has to do with xenophobia, gender rights. And he's also trying to take, say, femicide off the criminal code, right? What's now interesting is that Doge is actually inspired by Milei. So in March,
Sounds like Doge,
yeah,
for sure.
exactly.
Yeah.
So in March last year, Musk met with Milei, right? And then they sort of had a chat, and he was inspired for, and it served as an inspiration for Doge. Now, the CPAC meeting happened in DC recently, and Milei was center stage. And he gifted a silver chainsaw to Elon Musk, who then took it on stage, right? Same thing you see, like, say, Brazil, for instance, right? You had Bolsonaro, who calls himself the Trump of the tropics, right? When he lost the elections for his bid at the second term, he did something very similar to what Trump fans did on January 6th. His supporters stormed the parliament, I believe, right? And then a police investigation happened, and he has been, indicted for, trying to overturn the government, trying to assassinate a federal judge, trying to assassinate the president-elect, right? Now, when Trump won, he basically said, this federal judge who's, trying to charge him, he told Trump that maybe we should take care of this guy, right? And so then Trump's media company sues this federal judge in Brazil because he's apparently, encroaching on free speech, because he's been attacked. By the way, he's been attacking X, and and has fined X, and so on and so forth. So there is this almost cosmopolitan global revolution that's happening, where that's working across the North-South divide to really, undermine whatever liberal institutions, if we consider them to be liberal institutions that are there globally, to have a truly global right revolution, I think.
Many of us on the left are also critical of this liberal international order thing. And indeed, even a lot of like the academic writing and research has come from the left. Possibly like we might have different solutions to it than the right. But how does that kind of complicate the global politics?
Well, that totally complicates the global politics, right? In the sense that, one of the arguments, and I'm not saying that I agree with the far right, but it's sort of like, the saying about the broken clock that's tells the right time twice a day, right? It's sort of, it has also honed in on the hypocrisies of the liberal institutions, of liberal political figures, of all these proponents of liberal values, right? A lot of people have recognized how those red lines that liberals talk about, went out of the window when Palestine happened, right? When Gaza happened. So I think a Russian politician mentioned this, and begrudgingly you're going, oh, this is speaking to something, who said that, I think he was talking about, if Europeans feel like they can't sleep because of what's happening between Ukraine and Russia, just imagine that it's happening in Africa or in the Middle East. So you'll be fine. Right. So we know that the liberalism is rooted in very racialized understandings of the global order, where liberal ideas and values and are only applicable to certain groups of people. And we saw that, with Palestine versus Ukraine, right? Where resistance was resistance when it was Ukrainians, but wasn't with Palestinians. We saw that with the European migration crisis, right? Where, when Syrian refugees came into Denmark, we were, taking away their taking away their jewelry. But then when Ukrainians refugees came, it was solidarity all around.
All the Facebook groups open up. Do you guys need a bed? Do you need some winter jackets?
Again, that's how it should be. And I'm happy for Ukrainians that they got that solidarity, but also tells us that kind of those liberal sentiments are not inflamed when the victim is someone who looks like me or darker.
I was actually in Copenhagen for a time when there was a large influx of Ukrainian, migrants due to the Russian invasion, and I remember I was looking for something on like one of these Facebook groups where you give away your stuff,
Right.
And I would see all these different, posts of people saying, I'm a Ukrainian, thanks for welcoming me here. My family needs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And within an hour, you would get like tons of people saying, oh, I have this, please come and pick it up. I can deliver this to you. And people from other places who were of a different hue would post a similar, maybe even less entitled kind of like, not to throw shade on any Ukrainian, but just a modest request, and almost nobody would reply.
Yeah, that's par for the course, right? In the sense that, I mean, that's how it's been happening, and that's how, there are certain spaces where people who look like me or darker aren't meant to be, right? And and that's a reflection of that, right? So I remember, as a political scientist at the University of Copenhagen doing my PhD, I've been called a lazy N-word, right? Someone told me that since I was, we were talking about, immigrants and, their skills or whatever, and they said that, well, you're Indian, you're good at raping women, right? That's your skill set, right? One colleague kept calling me an N-word baby when he was drunk, and he grabbed me by the neck, and so that's the kind of environment, and this is an educated environment. It's not, it's sort of everyday academic sort of space. I'm one brown guy in a largely white environment. I have no real leverage here as a PhD or a postdoc. But that's the kind of responses you get, right? So imagine when, people like when people like me are being portrayed as sort of an extension of this global existential crisis, when your values are being challenged, people are unsafe and all of that, right? One can only imagine what the response would that be to that community, right? So, in many ways, I feel like all of this is sort of deeply intertwined, right? But yeah.
So, related to this conversation, you write that you write about Fanon in your last chapter, which is called On Liberation. Quote, in his essay on national culture, Fanon also criticizes colonized African intellectuals for their attempts to revive the national community by uncovering what they consider to be the authentic pre-colonial culture. For Fanon, however, any such effort to recover a cultural identity that is untarnished by the colonizer is doomed to fail, because it aims to demonstrate the existence of a Negro or a Negro-African culture, a culture that is entirely a construction of the colonizer. It is the colonizer who does not care to differentiate among the various national communities living on the continent, and instead categorizes the entirety of the inhabitants of Africa as a single Negro population, albeit one that lacks a discernible cultural heritage. So where do we go from here? I mean, it only takes a few generations for certain things to seep in, yeah?
Right.
Where do we go?
I mean, you tell me, because
it's not back to before colonizing,
Yeah, I mean,
what
we
are
don't
we gonna do with this?
we don't have any structures, institutions, anything in place that would allow us to go back to that time. And it's completely unrealistic. It wouldn't happen. History doesn't work that way, right? Yes, we can't change history, but we can choose what to do with it. Yet again, we are living in an international political system and an economic order that doesn't allow us the freedom, the ingenuity to construct a present and future that is our own, that is not embossed by those legacies of those hierarchies, right? Which is why the chief minister of a state can say that we want to be like London without any sense of what that really means. I mean, she put a miniature Big Ben in the city.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
The clock doesn't work anymore, but
Oh, so it was built actually.
Yeah, it was built, but it was like miniature, and it was in the middle of a very busy intersection on the way back from the airport. So it means that it always causes traffic jams. And every time I've been there, the clock don't work. So it's just
what is like the sort of colloquial joke about it?
I mean, it's very much symbolic of who she is. Like, she just sort of, says things. She was just in London, and there was a whole like, it's all performative bull, right? In the sense that, there's no substance to it. So she wanted to build the eye, the London eye, and that didn't work. But now she's in like London, wearing a sari, doing her morning walk, right? It's her and a bunch of Indian uncles, and apparently that's sort of her claiming space in the metropole, right? So it's like we lack the imagination of what to do, where to go from here, right? We're always aspiring to be, apparently decolonization has become, and liberation is all about staking a seat at the table of the colonizer and doing as they would, right?
And not upending the whole kind of infrastructure, ideas.
Absolutely. There's none of that. So it makes it very difficult to think about a truly liberated future when we haven't worked on, a language for that, right? I mean, in that sense, one of the things that we've been talking about after the book came out, and something I wish I had written about, is, something as, as elementary as the state, right? Oftentimes when we think about liberation, liberation is equal to the state, right? But it's about so much more. And that's what, say, Palestinians protesting a few years ago in the West Bank were trying to tell us, that it's not about the Palestinian Authority. It's not about having the military or the police and have all the performance of statecraft, right? We know the state is an extremely brutal institution, right? I mean, it thrives on that. It survives because of that. So why is that where the liberation is hanging out? So, I know, so Palestinian activists have been, trying to tell us about what liberation could truly look like. It's about ideas. It's about values. There's a reason why, there are messages of solidarity flowing from South Africa to the Zapatista, to the West Bank, to Gaza, to Kashmir, that they're all speaking to each other in similar language. There's a reason why the Palestinian flag comes up, in Kashmir, and the Indian state brings it down. It tells you who's sitting at what table and what goal they're looking towards, right? But it's a very disturbing reality, and a reality that is equally supported and buttressed by these international organizations and development organizations and NGOs who lack the creativity to think about alternative futures, because they go from one funding cycle to another, and the parameters are very clearly set up, in London, in Brussels, wherever, right?
Yeah.
So we're in this sort of,
and with the interests and sort of legislated national strategies of those countries in mind. I mean, these are you get a parliament or a congress or what have you to approve a particular program based on quote national interests, but
you're essentially creating a lot of the development institutes. What they're essentially doing is creating a generation of people in different parts of the world, specifically in the global south, that speak the same language and would help facilitate our interests in that part of the world. That's all that they're doing, right? They all speak the same jingle, same what do you call the buzzwords? They talk about the same. Sometimes I don't even, intersectional, sustainability, SDG something, and I'm like, what are you talking about? Like substantively, what are you talking about, right? But yeah,
Somdeep, we like to honor a little tradition here of allowing our guests to have any kind of final word on the topics we've discussed. Do you have anything else to say?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that these conversations that we are having, I mean, it's really great to have a conversation about this, because, people don't understand the very personal impulse of the book. It is about these very existential questions about, can we be liberated? When are we liberated? What would that look like? How can we imagine a liberated future? And for me, these sorts of questions is what inspired, that book, rather than, me trying to make some sort of authoritative conclusion about what Hamas is or is not, right?
Right.
And which is why you'll find in the book that I tend to jump from, I'll be in Gaza talking about a very sort of dense experience, and then sort of jump to South Africa or something like that, because that's my mental space where I'm trying to think about this global interconnected struggle. And it's very important to think about our struggles as deeply interconnected. Of course, with the far right, we see how interconnected it really is.
We feel it.
We feel
it in the day-to-day.
Right. But then I think, as with the sort of, let's say, in the academic terms, the methodological impulse of the book, of these long stories, I think that's also very important to me, because a lot of times the interconnectedness of our world and the struggles is only revealed when we have these conversations that are not about, that are about really learning about each other, rather than, solidifying ourselves in whatever position or positionality we're in. And I think that we can learn a lot from those types of conversations. So,
Somdeep, let's divine the future. I'd like you to just shuffle up this card deck, put your energy into it, and then ask it a question, and we'll take whatever card is on the top.
I'm really bad at shuffling cards, and this is a real insecurity of mine. My parents never let me play cards because that was seen as close to gambling. So this is as good as it's going to get.
Sure.
So,
okay. So what question would you like to ask about our future?
Can we ever be liberated?
All right. Let's see what.
So I just take one card on the top. Palace coup.
Palace coup. That's a very cynical. Okay. So, can you read it for us?
Yeah. When civilian resistance threatens to depose a dictator, that dictator may try to short-circuit the people by handing over power to one of his own. This is known as a palace coup, or a faux overthrow. Okay.
A overthrow.
Overthrow. Okay.
So basically, the card deck is saying no.
No,
we can never be liberated. No. How do you take it?
Well, now that I was gonna sit and think about it, but now that you put it that way, yeah, is this
Or is this just something we need to watch out for? Because we have had, at least in national context, quite a
Right.
number of these, right?
Well, I mean,
Or in corporate context.
I mean, when Obama won, I was very emotional,
Mm.
but that felt like a overthrow.
Yeah, sure.
I thought racism was over when he won,
Right.
But I think that's interesting because
Mm.
oftentimes we get caught up in the symbolic nature of some of these changes and don't really think about what is the substantive change that's happening. And I think that's a kind of palace coup, right, where you somehow appease the liberal anxiety by placing someone who speaks the right language and seems to be on your side,
but it's still in bed with all the companies.
All the companies are doing the same. So I mean, one of the numbers, of course, things have changed now, but then Biden had deported more people than Trump in his first term. I mean, I'm sure that's going to change now. But, there's a lot of the, Biden's policies towards Palestine. I mean, all of that sort of, it reminds you that.
But he doesn't mind gay people.
No, but that's
the point, right?
That's the point, right? Exactly. But
yeah,
palace coup. I'm gonna remember this.
Thanks so much for spending time with us today, Somdeep.
Thank you.
Hi. We hope you enjoyed the conversation on this episode of Troublemakers and feel inspired to stir up some good trouble in your own community. Do feel free to check out our other episodes and subscribe to Troublemakers Podcast in your preferred podcast app. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook as troublemakers.podcast for all the latest updates, behind-the-scenes content, and sneak peeks of what's coming next. We also love to hear from our listeners. You can email us via troublemakersthepodcast@gmail.com or simply drop a DM through our social media. And hey, if you enjoyed this episode, take a moment and share it with a friend or leave us a review. It really helps us grow our community of troublemakers. Keep shaking things up.